Yeah. Welcome back to another episode of Crypto and the Caribbean, the show we cover all things crypto and Caribbean related. I'm your host, L, and for today's episode, we're going to be talking a bit about Bitcoin in the Bahamas, as you could probably tell from the title. Also, there's a thunderstorm going on outside right now, so there's that. You might hear a bit of that in the video too. But let me reel it in. So, last year, a bit after Independence Day 2021, I wrote an article where I proposed the idea of increasing Bitcoin adoption in the Bahamas, or even on the more drastic side of things, introducing Bitcoin as a legal tender. I know, far-fetched, cool. I'll settle for adoption. I'll settle for increased adoption. But this year, I actually wrote a follow-up, a part 2 to that article on this Independence Day for 2022, where I reflected on all of the events that happened over the past year in the Bahamas, and I doubled down on my stance that adopting Bitcoin or increasing Bitcoin adoption in the Bahamas could definitely serve as a great benefit to the people and the country as a whole. So I ain't get too much into that right now, but let's run the intro. So, like I said, I've written 2 articles on this topic of Bitcoin in the Bahamas, and I'm thinking about just making it a series at this point where I address different topics or different areas surrounding Bitcoin and its introduction or possible increased adoption in the Bahamas. Because these 2 articles, I do touch on some subjects, but I keep it relatively surface level, so it doesn't go as in depth as you can go, and it doesn't cover a lot of the arguments or the pain points that are brought up when resisting or debating the idea of increasing Bitcoin adoption in the country. But let's just jump straight to these. So I'll give you the first one for some context and the second one to show you where I'm currently at. So first up, we have the first article here, Bitcoin in the Bahamas, Freedom and Independence in a New Age, right? So the introduction, right? It's just me using a bunch of words to describe how the Bahamas just got independence in 1973, which wasn't that long ago, and how prior to that we were under British rule, what independence means for the Bahamas, and how the precedent or the idea of independence stands for the Bahamas' ability to act on its own with little to no oversight from any outside forces. Was that lightning? So, in the next part of the article here, I cover some stats and some demographic information for the Bahamas. Over 75% of the country's GDP comes from tourism and the tourism industry, the hospitality industry. And in second place is offshore banking and financial services, and that's not even close with like 15%. So the chunk, a decent chunk of the country's money comes from tourism, point blank. And with an international crisis like, I don't know, the COVID-19 pandemic, really highlighting how inefficient that business model is for an entire country, we're long overdue for an infrastructural overhaul. It's time. It's just time. So, some more stats here. We got the population of the Bahamas sitting around roughly 400K, give or take. The currency of the Bahamas, the Bahamian dollar, maintaining almost a 1-to-1 peg with the US dollar. The Bahamas' minimum wage, and correct me if I'm wrong or if it's been updated since the time that I wrote this, but at the time that this first one was written, which was last summer, 2021, minimum wage was at $5.25 an hour. Now that works up to roughly about $2.10 a week and about 11K annual. Studies were showing that about 15% of the population lives below the poverty line, which is different in every country. So every country has their own statistics and metrics, and they determine themselves what the poverty line is. So there's no universal poverty line. There's no set number that's applied to every country. So for the Bahamas, the poverty line sits at about 5K per year. If you're at or under 5K, then you're below the poverty line by Bahamian standards, which in comparison to the US, which has 12,500, is pretty low. So anything from 5 to 12 in the US is below the poverty line, but that's above poverty in the Bahamas. just for context. And the GDP for 2020 came at about $11.25 billion measured in USD. Now, why is any of this important? Well, that's because I wanted to give a direct comparison to another country that I wanted to observe. We'll get to that country in a second. This next section, I just used some nice words and light humor to talk about why I think Bitcoin adoption can help the country. We'll skip that part for now. But then we come down to the actual comparison that I wanted to make earlier with those stats on the Bahamas. And we're looking at El Salvador. And the reason we're looking at El Salvador is because this nation was the first country in the world to actually adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. And what they had prior to this, believe it or not, was USD. So the country's primary currency was USD. And what the president decided to do was not replace USD with Bitcoin, but add it as an additional option. So the citizens could use USD or Bitcoin for any of their day-to-day expenses throughout the entire country. Now let's look at some stats real quick. Now, the Bitcoin law itself was established September 7th. So when I wrote this article, this was before the Bitcoin law had even been passed. It was in talks and it was anticipated. Everything was being prepped for it. But when I wrote this, everything was purely speculative. There was nothing concrete yet. So coming down to some of the stats. Population of El Salvador, 6.5 million people roughly. You're looking at about 22% of that 6.5 million people living below their established poverty line, which was about $5.50 a day. So their poverty line in El Salvador was just 25 cents higher than minimum wage in the Bahamas. And then GDP report for 2020, 24.61 billion USD. Now, keeping all these things in mind, I was fair. I did point out that yes, more than likely in its initial rollout, there were gonna be problems. There's still a high lack in proper education for the people. The Chivo wallet was an absolute disaster and still continues to disappoint. So like these things were expected. Even before they started the law, before they enacted the law and made it official, problems were expected. But I still was confident that it would work out in the end. So now, the reason for the direct comparison. Zooming out and looking at the Bahamas compared to El Salvador. El Salvador has over 16 times the country's population. They have a higher percentage of people living below their relative poverty line. And they have a lower minimum wage, which I think came out to about $1.50 to $2 per hour in El Salvador. So despite these numbers, despite the metrics and the demographic they was working with, they still decided to push forward with this Bitcoin law and enacting Bitcoin as legal tender alongside their existing currency. And it definitely sounded like a crazy idea. It sounded like the wildest concept any nation's leader could come up with. But realistically, it wasn't that wild to allow people to use Bitcoin for payments. It's being done in countries all over the world already. Yes, it's not officially legal tender in any of these places, but it's a common practice. The number of Bitcoin users continues to increase, especially in developing countries that tend to have less to lose. So coming down to the next section, my main question, what is there to lose? Opening up the Bahamas to the world of crypto. More specifically, opening up the Bahamas to Bitcoin adoption. And I mean, really, it isn't that hard to implement it, if we're being honest. When you look at it, we already have the implementation of the Sand Dollar, which is a digital payment system that they plan on implementing countrywide. So if we already have a countrywide infrastructure being built out for some form of digital payments, just throw Bitcoin on that too. It's actually that easy. Just make easier on-ramps for people to access Bitcoin, and it's pretty much the same thing. If education is an issue, we have more than enough people actively in the Caribbean community alone that are willing and ready to help out and start creating content, creating these avenues and different ways for education to be implemented and to ensure that people are properly educated on how to navigate the space, how to deal with the technology, how to handle these new digital assets. Policies and regulation, Before I wrote this article, they had the DARE Act already fleshed out, the FCSP Act right there with it. So they're already laying the groundwork for all of this stuff. Just tacking Bitcoin on shouldn't be that big of a deal. And coming back down here to the next few paragraphs, I use a lot of nice words and fancy writing just to illustrate different ways that the implementation of Bitcoin can actually help benefit the people and the country of the Bahamas. Like, look at this. I'm talking about new economic systems, the implementation of QR codes, the elevation from cash payments that have been constraining us to this day, the possibility of new digital endowment funds for schools, diversifying the country's GDP, international payments and remittances. I kind of went off in this section a little bit. You should check it out. People say I'm a cool writer. And then wrapping up to the finale. My main thing there is why not? Why not try it? Why not at least try? You know? What do we actually have to lose there? I feel that the worst case scenario in that case, not saying bringing it as a legal tender, but increasing Bitcoin's adoption. The worst case scenario there is that we're in the exact same boat we're in right now, but we have Bitcoin with it. I don't see that as a loss at all. But that's just me. On to the next one. Now the follow-up here, Bitcoin in the Bahamas Part 2. I dropped this one on Independence Day. And the purpose of this one was to actually look back over the past year, like I said earlier, at everything that happened in the Bahamas from the first article, or from Independence Day 2021 up till Independence Day 2022, and why this 1 year of events has made me double down on my stance that implementing or increasing the adoption of Bitcoin in the Bahamas can play a huge factor in helping to change the country for the better. So let's actually take a look at some of these changes that happened over the span of just 1 year. One, and a huge one, FTX sets up a home base in the Bahamas. Now, FTX being easily one of the biggest, most popular exchanges in the world, setting up a home base in the Bahamas is kind of a big deal. And needless to say, the DARE Act, the Digital Assets and Registered Exchanges Act, and the FCSP, the Financial and Corporate Service Providers Act, both of those together definitely played a heavy part in opening the doors to something like this. Because those were meant in essence to show that the Bahamas was ready and willing to start regulating, in a sense, this new asset class, these digital assets. And like I said in one of these videos, they wanted to set the blueprint for how to actually handle regulation for these types of things. Now, not much has actually been done by FTX since they've been there. They announced the 60+ million investment in HQ in a commercial center. They donated over $500,000 to Lend a Hand Bahamas, but other than that, not too much action on that front. But that's not to say we can't expect some big things to come from FTX. A little bit more on that in a sec. But next up, we have the Bahamas drop in its white paper. Now, the white paper, entitled The Future of Digital Assets in the Bahamas, was a 9-page doc essentially laying out the guidelines that the Bahamas planned on using going forward into this new digital assets industry. So it highlighted that the Bahamas was open to these types of businesses and this new industry, and was welcome to inviting these companies, inviting these ideas, and integrating it into our own society. In fact, there were 6 themes that I picked up on throughout the entire white paper. And these 6 themes encompass, I think, the gist of the white paper itself. Those themes being openness, speed, adaptability, forethought, reputation, and Bahamian accessibility. And they outright say this is going to be an evolving law. This is going to be an evolving regulatory process, because they acknowledge that there are unknown unknowns. There are things that they don't know and things that they're not even aware of yet. But as the industry evolves, as the industry grows, they're setting up the guidelines and the people in place and the regulatory bodies to help them make the right decisions so that they can change and adapt along with the industry. Moving on to the next one. Funny enough, just 1 week after the white paper dropped, we had Crypto Bahamas, which was the country's first ever government supported cryptocurrency conference, hosted by, you guessed it, FTX. Because who else could do it? It was co hosted by Salt too, but it was FTX. And it was a 4-day event they had at Bahamas Resort, right? So they had people coming in from all over the world. They had people from the industry. You had artists, athletes, developers, experts, gurus, you name it. You've seen them on TV, you've seen them on YouTube. They were at this event. And mind you, the event was relatively nice. I wasn't able to attend in person, but I did live stream the 3 days of the event. And I have to be honest, it was on par with many of the other conferences that I've seen. If you want to check it out, the majority of them are still available on YouTube. The links for all of these things I'll have down in the description so y'all can find them. And then the next part, I wanted to highlight Bitcoin's adoption in a global sense. So zooming out, stepping outside of the Bahamas for a second, I wanted to make a callback to the reference to El Salvador that I made in the previous article. So in the first article, this was before the Bitcoin law was enacted, and in this article, the Bitcoin law has been in effect for almost a full year at this point. We're about 2 months off from it being a full year, so 10 months into the experiment. So we have more context, we have some data we can run with, and we have a little bit more experience with how it's being implemented, how the progression is going, what the reception is like, and all of these things. So I wanted to look at that and see where we're at right now. And I have to address it. As it stands right now, the media, as we know, loves nothing more than kicking the underdog while they're down. So if you're looking or you hear anything El Salvador related, probably in the past month, 2 months, you're gonna see more headlines like this that we have here from the New York Times. A poor country made Bitcoin a national currency. The bet isn't paying off, right? So I wanted to directly address just a couple of the criticisms. There are other articles that address more of the criticisms and go in depth, but like I said, I wanted to keep these relatively surface level so that anyone could get a general understanding and just get the gist of what I'm talking about here. So, first quote, coming directly from the article: the government's Bitcoin holdings have lost about 60% of their presumed value during the recent market plunge. Which is true. Can't knock them for that. It's true. But it's also true that at a certain point, those holdings were 50% up from their initial investment. So what are we talking about? You're just gonna write about it when it's down, when it's not performing well? And let's be real, nothing is performing well right now. Everything is down. We're in a down market. There's everything has been in the red for a while now. So let's not pretend like Bitcoin is the only thing that's going down and this wasn't expected. This wasn't a quick flip. President Bukele bought Bitcoin and continues to buy Bitcoin, expecting long-term success. He's not expecting immediate gains. He's not expecting less than a year later to see monumental returns on it. This is a long play. So what are we even talking about? 60% down. Okay, then when it's like 60-70% up, are we gonna write another article about it, or we're just gonna pretend like it doesn't happen and wait for the next bear market? Like what? Anyway, next quote: the use of Bitcoin among Salvadorans has collapsed and the country is running out of cash after Mr. Bukele, not president, Mr. Bukele, failed to raise fresh funds from cryptocurrency investors. So first of all, collapsed is wild. Collapse is kind of nuts. It's been less than a year. The experiment hasn't been going on for a full year yet. How do you even measure that metric? How do you determine that it's collapsed? And doesn't collapsed imply that it's done for? Like it's just there's no use for it going forward? Like what are we talking about? That's flagrant. Like you are blatantly jumping the gun. And running out of cash. Okay. Next up, The failure of Mr. Bukele's stated objectives for Bitcoin to bring investment to the country and financial services to the poor. Okay, so first up, to bring investment to the country. So we're going to ignore the government reports that tourism has increased over 30% and the GDP has increased over 10% since the enactment of the bill. So in less than a year, they had seen a 30% increase in tourism and a 10% increase in GDP. But that's failing to bring investment to the country. And then here, failing to bring financial services to the poor. I can give to you that they haven't adequately educated the masses and they haven't properly implemented these new tools and resources for the general populace to use. But failing to bring financial services to the people, again, it's less than a year. The Chivo wallet was a disaster. Yes, absolute basura. It was garbage. But give it some time. He's still feeling it out. Like, this is no one else thinks this is kind of wild. They say most businesses, even if they're going to be successful, most businesses aren't profitable in their first couple years. What are we actually expecting from this right now? Not saying that it's a business, but if we can give businesses that you expect future success from that leeway to just experiment in the first year, 2, 3 years, why are we so quick to judge in 10 months of the implementation of a new financial system in a developing country? Like, come on, man. Come on. And again, I highlight here, simply granting access to Bitcoin takes nothing away from the citizens. It leaves them in no worse position than they already were in, because they have a choice. Like, they can still use USD, they can still use the regular currency. No one's forcing them to only or exclusively use Bitcoin. You have that option. So simply providing them that option of Bitcoin doesn't take anything away from them. Now, the education part of it and ensuring that they know how to safely and properly use it and when it would be best or efficient for them to use it, that's a different story. But simply providing it does not diminish or take away from the people. It doesn't. And just to bring it home, if the experiment was such a failure, why are even more countries looking to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender? We already have the Central African Republic, second country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. And then we have other smaller nations, other smaller regions, Prospera, Roatan, Madeira. Yeah, those aren't major countries. Yeah, you may not know where they are on the map. Yeah, you probably didn't even know these places existed before I told you those names. That's cool. That's completely fine. But it's still happening. And the number is steadily increasing every year. So right now it's 2, then it'll be 3, 5, 10, 15, 20.
5, 10, 15, 20. More and more and more.
And what you're seeing there is the growth of a steady majority. So if this thing is such a failure, why are so many willing to try it? Why are so many willing to take that risk? And if so many people are willing to take that risk with a new financial system, what does that say about the existing one? If they're in a position where they would much rather take the risk than maintain the status quo. Think about that. But anyway, just tying it all up, all of these things being considered, I think the Bahamas is in an even better position now than I did last year to adopt Bitcoin. Even if it's not as legal tender, just increasing Bitcoin, not crypto, Bitcoin adoption in the country. Crypto's gonna come. That's inevitable. It's gonna happen. But with a special focus on Bitcoin specifically, I think there's a lot of potential that we're really not tapping into yet. Because we're in a market downturn, FUD all over the news. Large companies, large corporation industries are going bankrupt, disappearing off the face of the earth, going MIA, getting sued left, right, and center, liquidating all of their holdings, not paying people back, in debt. All these things are going on, but Bitcoin adoption is still increasing. So it all boils down to the same question. Why not try it? what do we actually have to lose in trying it, in increasing Bitcoin adoption? What do we have to lose? But that's just me, and these are my thoughts. I'm a guy on the internet. I like crypto. I love Bitcoin. And I like talking about this stuff because I see a lot of potential in it, especially for places like my home, the Bahamas. All that being said, though, thank you for coming through, kicking it with me for another episode of Crypto and the Caribbean, listening to me run on about my love of Bitcoin for however long this video is. I don't know. I haven't edited it yet, so it's gonna be shorter than I think it actually is. But make sure, if you haven't already, hit that like, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell so you don't miss when we drop any new content. Like I say on every episode, the network has almost 20 different shows, all covering different aspects of the crypto space. Anything that you're gonna want to know or need to find out, we have the resources for it. So hit the bell so you don't miss any of them, and you could catch up on some of these other shows. Also, if you have any opinions on anything that I shared in this episode, let me know down in the comments. Like, just say whatever it is. I'll be down there checking y'all out, or at least I'll try to. I'll be honest, I'm not the best at going through all the comments in these videos, but I definitely try, so it counts for something. But if that's not enough, you really want to have a discussion, or you're just trying to reach me in general, the best way to do that is in my link tree. The link tree is the place where I have all of my socials, all of my written content, my video content, basically anything you need to find out about me, you can find right there in that link tree. Link's gonna be down in the description along with everything else, I guess. So again, thank y'all for coming through. Till next episode, we can link.